5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Order, order. Well, good afternoon, colleagues, for this second meeting of the week. It's nice to see you all here, and nice to welcome such a stellar lineup from the Cabinet Office. Kat, Nick, Hermione, you're all very welcome, and thank you for finding the time to see us this afternoon on our general sort of catch-up, really, with regards to the work of the Cabinet Office, what's going on, what's in the inbox, what do you wish wasn't in the inbox, but is there nonetheless. Before we kick into questions, let me just ask colleagues if there are any declarations of interest which anybody wishes to make. Charlotte.
Subject to what might be discussed, I should declare that I am a civil service pensioner.
This is my opportunity to say you don't look old enough, but there we go. So you obviously took very, 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 very early retirement. Fine, thank you for that, and that has been recorded. You're right, I did want to ask, and I think if I may turn to this question first, as I understand it, Cabinet Office have issued some communication during the course of this morning with regards to the disturbing and unsettling situation with regards to civil service pensions. This is obviously the first time Parliament will have had the opportunity to ask anybody from the Cabinet Office about this. I wonder if you could just briefly set the scene as to what has triggered the writing of the letter and what you envisage the next steps and course of action to be.
Well, thank you very much, Chair, and Charlotte, if I may say so, I think that was a very pertinent declaration of interest, as this is the first topic we're going to be discussing. But before I come to the details, I should say openly at the outset that the service or lack thereof that is being provided to people who have obviously worked for many years and given their lives to public service is completely and utterly unacceptable. And I will, in a moment, turn to the Permanent Secretary to give some details of the recovery plan that we have put in place. But there's some other specific matters I want to deal with. And Chair, you may recall the original pensions provider, my CSP, was providing this service. The Capita contract was signed in November of 2023, and then the actual formal handover, changeover as it were, was in December of last year. It should be said, first of all, that there was a very significant backlog that was inherited. The most up-to-date figure I've got is around about 86,000 cases, so a very significant backlog that was passed from my CSP to Capita. And what we've been seeing, I'm afraid, and this, I'm sure members around the table are probably getting this into their inboxes, I would have thought as well, from public servants who live in their constituencies. It's a variety of things. It's newly retired people who are not being able to access their pensions when they should be able to. Delays to quotes. There are people are logging in. Details are incomplete. They're getting inaccurate quotes. So there is a real set of problems here that we need to deal with. Now, I have already met Adolfo Hernandez, the Chief Executive of Capita. And I've met him, it was back towards the end of last year, and made clear what my expectations were in respect of this contract. I recognised, and we all recognised, there was going to be this problem of the backlog. I think Capita have subsequently said that they underestimated the complexity of this scheme, which may be one of the explanations as to why we find ourselves in the position that we do. I will be seeing again tomorrow directly the Chief Executive of Capita to once again set out not only on the situation, the unacceptable situation that people are facing who are seeking to use this scheme, but also what we will be doing and our expectations going forward. Now, we have put in place a recovery plan. It will be led by Angela MacDonald, who is the second Permanent Secretary at HMRC, so very senior level. We have a surge, we're providing a surge capacity of 168 people to Capita to try to urgently fix this problem. I have also today signed off hardship loans that can be administered by the different government departments for civil servants who, frankly, find themselves in a position of hardship as a consequence of not receiving the pension payments that they should be. We're putting into place in that recovery plan as well prioritisation. I'm sure, as members would expect, it's things like death in service or ill health retirements, or indeed when people find themselves in situations of hardship that need to be prioritised in this recovery period. Before I turn to Kat, though, to ask her to set out that plan in a bit more detail, I just want to make absolutely clear here as well that we do reserve our rights, not only under the Capita contract, but I have to say as well under the previous contract as well, the My CSP contract. And you'll appreciate, Chair, that there's a commercial sensitivity to such matters, but I do observe the size of the backlog that was inherited by Capita. So it's in that context that I say that our contractual rights are being reserved under both these contracts, not just the current one. And if I could turn
just before we turn to Ms Little, can I just ask one question that flows, Minister, from what you've just said? You referenced the fact that at the point of transfer there was a backlog, and you've told us that Capita had underestimated it. But was there an agreed process at the contingent upon the transfer, where there was a plan in place for Capita to? Now, they may have been overwhelmed by the scale, but was there a plan in place about how to reduce and eradicate it?
So the straight answer to that is yes, and I'll come to the Permanent Secretary to set it out. But just again to be clear with members, that there was a backlog was known. It was something that I had spoken to the Chief Executive of Capita about, so it did not come as a surprise. But in terms of both that aspect and under the recovery plan, I will turn to the Permanent Secretary, but I also just want to say to the committee as well, our priority now is dealing with this issue of the immediate hardship and problems that have been caused to people. That's why I've signed off the hardship loans, and I think getting a grip of this is the priority now.
So to answer your question, Chair, the answer is yes. There was a full worked through transition plan, and as the Minister mentioned, ultimately when the contracting for Capita took place, the estimate of the work in progress was significantly lower. And I would just emphasise that this service has been in distress for some time. This is not a new issue. The reason I took the action to get in touch with all scheme members through any means possible today is because I sincerely believe that the scale and the level of hardship that people are enduring is just not good enough. So just to give you a bit of detail about the very specific recovery plan, we have 3 sprints which are being undertaken by our task force. Each of those sprints has a specific area of priority, and it is focused on primarily making sure that any pensioners who have retired in recent months get their first pension payment. So from the 1st of December, we're aware that there's a very large number of civil servants who have retired. On average, around 3,000 civil servants retire every single month, just to give you a sense of the scale. And many of those civil servants will not have received their first pension payment. So that is priority area number 1. We are also prioritising anyone who has sadly had a recent bereavement, so for spouses, partners, families impacted, anyone who has retired on ill health, we will prioritise the most extreme and urgent cases as quickly as possible, and we expect for those cases to be stabilised and dealt with by the end of February. Our second sprint will move on to the wider set of issues in the backlog, and there's quite a large range of outstanding queries. We've got a number of queries which have not been dealt with through email, through call centres. We must get back to people so that they've got the answers that they need to be able to undertake big life decisions. These are often stressful and difficult choices that people are trying to make, and they need the information from our pension scheme to be able to make those life choices. And then we have a third phase which will continue to the end of March. We'll be looking at some of the other issues. So we know that there are some technical issues with the portal. There is information that we need to make sure is connecting between the previous service and the one that we have now. We'll also be looking at website functionality and the use of technology to make it easier for people to access their information. So there's a lot underway, and I would very much welcome being able to regularly update this committee. Finally, I should say that your sister committee, the PAC, has undertaken a recent investigation, and we would very much like to make sure that we are able to keep the PAC as well up to date.
Okay, thank you for that. And obviously you're before us on the 10th of February, and I think an update on progress then would be appreciated. Just before I bring in Mr. Lamont and Mrs. Kane, you've just set out there in your answer, and I took a jot of your words, that there have been a fully worked through transition plan from my CSP through to Capita, focused on eradication of or reduction and then eradication of the backlog. What was the reporting system of that back to Cabinet Office by Capita on progress?
So we have an agreed set of management information, and this has been one of the big challenges, because quite a lot of that management information, whilst there is an agreed set, has to be manually produced by Capita, and that inevitably has led to us having to reconcile information that we hold with Capita in order to get a grip on the situation. So the first thing that my teams have had to do is to understand exactly what the performance of Capita has been, because that information has been slower and harder to get hold of than we would like.
And do you detect slower and harder deliberately slower?
I should say Capita have been absolutely open to every single suggestion, open conversation that we've had right from the start. They regularly have updated me almost on a daily basis, and certainly before we transferred the contract, they were very open with myself and with the Minister for the Cabinet Office on the scale of the challenge. And so I don't think there is any ill will on the part of Capita.
When did the gentle tinkling of the sort of alarm clock, as it were, become the deafening clanging of Big Ben on this issue?
I think probably the first week of January. So, that was when a combination of MI, a significant increase in complaints, not just coming through to the Cabinet Office, but also to departments, to members of Parliament. As I say, this service has been in distress, so there was a notable uptick at that point. And we also were aware of challenges with the portal. They had service downtime. They had a challenge with their call centre. So it became very, very visible in the first week of January that there was a more significant set of issues to be dealt with.
Once again, Capita have given some grist to the private eye mill. I've got Charlotte Kane and then I've got John Lamont. Charlotte.
So I welcome the hardship grants. I would ask that you probably send all MPs, because I'm sure we've all got it in our inbox, details of that, because I've got at least 2 people in that situation. I'd also like you to consider whether people could get some sort of compensation, because these 2 people had made financial commitments on the expectation of getting their lump sum. Having not got it, they've had to go for quite expensive last-minute loans. So obviously they're out of pocket. I would just say I hear what you say about Capita inheriting a backlog, but the portal is theirs, and the portal isn't working for everyone. I have one constituent who's been trying to get on the portal since about November, and when he first rang up, he was told it wasn't working, wait a few weeks. And then he was told, oh, try again next week. Then we were asked to advise him to enter his name slightly differently because he had 2 forenames, and they advised him to enter both of those and said that would then be fine. And it wasn't. Now, I cannot imagine the irritation and upset that person feels, because they're trying to plan for their retirement, which is due this year, and they can't see their figures. Their communications are appalling. This person, every time he's rung, has waited online at least an hour and often 2 hours to get an answer that is meaningless. And the emails they send to people are from addresses to which you can't reply. And then I've had someone who's then replied to the address given in the email instead of the one from which it was sent, and had an automated reply saying her email is in the wrong format, so it can't be dealt with. When you're online waiting to get through about the portal, it says to you, you can answer most of your questions on the portal. Well, yes, if you can get into it. So that is their problem, and that is nothing to do with CPS. And then when people get on, as you say, the data isn't always there. They tell me that they're adding it gradually. So why isn't there a notice saying, don't worry that your beneficiaries' details aren't showing, they will be added by X date, check at X date. And people have sent them emails and just not got replies. They just don't reply. So their customer service is quite shocking. And as you say, these are people who've given years of public service, and they cannot get the most basic information. It could be people who want to pay some additional amounts before the end of the tax year, all sorts of things people might want to look at this data for at the moment, and they can't even get to see it. So they do need pushing on the portal.
No, and first of all, just to say, on the engagement with MPs, I'll certainly be looking to circulate a Dear Colleague letter with details. We'll be holding drop-ins tomorrow as well, so that parliamentary colleagues can come along with specific cases. And Charlotte, to your point there, your number of points about the portal, please do feed these details in to the Cabinet Office, because I'll take them up directly with Capita. And as I said, Chair, in the previous answer, I said we're reserving our rights under both these contracts as to both my CSP and indeed Capita in terms of the performance that not just the Cabinet Office, but frankly all those people who rely upon them are entitled to expect in terms of level of service. Just one point, in terms of the hardship loans, they're going to be administered by government department, but the reason we've done that very quickly is precisely the kinds of circumstances that you're talking about, where people who've obviously paid into their pensions for many, many years would entirely and rightly expect to then receive that in a timely manner. So I think that's very, very important. But I say, Chair, openly to everyone around the table, I'm sure that everybody around the table are going to have people in their inboxes, and it's really important that where there is experience that is falling way short of what is expected, that we are aware of that for our ability to hold Capita to account.
Thank you. John.
Thanks, Chair. Good afternoon. I think my question's maybe more to Catla. So I'm struggling a little bit with the timelines here. I think, Ms. Little, said that it'd been in distress for some time. How long exactly has it been in distress before this immediate action was taken back in the start of January?
Yes, so we transitioned from my CSP to Capita on the 1st of December.
Yeah.
So prior to that handover to Capita, there were significant issues with customer service, call waiting times. You're absolutely right, Charlotte, to say that ultimately a lot of this is also new to Capita, but certainly the service levels, call waiting, lack of response to queries, trouble getting information has been a long-standing set of issues with my CSP. And we have...
Is that months or years, or just to get a sense of...
It would have been over a period of years.
Right.
So, and that has been part of our decision to transition to a new provider. in the interests of seeking to improve customer service and better technology. And I should say the market for pension schemes is a fairly limited market. There aren't many providers, and these are highly complex, very large schemes. The civil service pension scheme is around 1.7 million members, so it is one of the largest and most complex schemes that we have in the country.
But it was in a state of distress, which was the term that you used, but at no point did that trigger this action which has been taken this year.
It hasn't been as acute. So there have been continual service delays, lack of meeting our contractual service requirements, and under the previous contract, we have taken contractual rights to withhold payments and to exercise the full extent of the commercial levers that we've got. And again, for commercial reasons, I won't get into all of the detail here, but your sister committee has done a very in-depth investigation into the way in which that contract was managed and handled.
So, just to be clear, the MyCSP contract was not. They were not performing that in the way that you would expect, and remedies were being pursued against them.
They were, and we had taken so there are different issues under the capital contract, which is why we put in place a very specific task force and recovery plan. Similar issues were identified, and appropriate commensurate actions were taken to either use commercial levers or to work with MyCSP to improve the performance under the previous contract.
And the underreporting of the backlog, I think they estimated the backlog was 37,000, but it might be twice that. Is that part of the remedies? Is that being pursued with MyCSP as well, in terms of their underreporting of that backlog?
So the 37,000 was at the time at which Capita contracted and bid for the work. So as we got into transition, and when you start these very large commercial handovers, it became clear that the backlog was closer to 87,000. So at no point has this been about MyCSP withholding information. It's that the assumptions the new provider made proved to be untrue by the time they actually took over the service.
Those assumptions would have been based on information that MyCSP had provided? At
the time of the contractual
negotiation.
Capita. Yeah.
So are you saying it got significantly worse in that period, or was it an underreporting by MyCSP?
It has got worse in the run-up to transition, and sadly this is not unusual for where a service is handing over to another provider. You often find that staff leave. The current service provider found it very difficult to maintain service levels.
And the scale of the backlog being greater than expected, does that have issues with the Capita contract now? I mean, are they now saying this is not what we signed up to?
So they are saying to us, it isn't what we signed up to, but we're going to do everything we can to get that backlog down and under control.
And in terms of this hardship fund that's been put in place, how much is that in total, and how many people would you define to be in hardship now?
We don't yet have a good estimate of how many people are in financial hardship. So having announced that this is now in place by departments, we'll start to gather that data. We know that around 8,500 members of the scheme will have some sort of issue with their payments since the 1st of December. I can't tell you today how many of those people have experienced financial hardship, but given most people rely on a pension to be paid, we can imagine it will be a significant number. The hardship loan, and it's an interest-free loan that departments will issue, is at a standard level of £5,000 with exceptional access to up to £10,000 for people who need more money.
You're budgeting for 8,000 people claiming up to the maximum, £10,000 potentially?
Yeah.
Right. And does that include, I mean, in terms of, supposing you had some other consequential payment to make dependent on your pension coming through, is there provision for consequential loss that people might find themselves in because of that payment not coming through?
So there is an existing compensation scheme within the pension contract, and I'm very happy to write to you with a bit more of the detail of how that compensation process works. So if people suffer because of having to, as in the case of your constituents, because they've had to make decisions or had to access emergency funds that have higher levels of interest rates, then there are ways to to access compensation.
Just lastly from me, is there going to be some sort of analysis of what has gone wrong here? I mean, it just strikes me we cannot have a scenario where an organisation that's providing a very important service is defined as being in distress for periods of years and no action. I mean, I might accept it goes across different governments, but the Permanent Secretary has not taken action to fix this. Is there going to be a lessons learned process?
Just to be very clear, we have taken action, and we've taken very, very urgent action to fix this, both under the previous contract and this one, to be very, very clear.
No, I get that, but you did also define, you said the service was in distress, and by any measure, certainly my measure, that would suggest that there was something going wrong with it long before the first week in January.
And action was taken. Which has already been under investigation by the Public Accounts Committee. So on the record, there is evidence about the action that both we have taken and also what MyCSP, the previous provider, has taken. The simple answer to your question, though, is yes, absolutely. I mean, clearly there will have to be a very thorough lessons learnt exercise, and I very much welcome Parliament's role in scrutinising the transition and what has happened here.
Thank you.
Thank you. Well, let's pause on this important issue now, and we'll pick it up again in a couple of weeks' time when you are before us. Thank you. Minister, let's turn, if we may, to UK-EU relations, an area that you have been involved with for a long period of time, both in government and in opposition. I wondered if you could tell us how you're rating progress since the last summit, when the next summit is due, and what your ambitions for that summit might be.
Well, thank you, Chair, and yes, indeed. I was described quite recently as, quote, long-serving, though I was surprised given what I feels like a relatively short amount of time I've been in the role in the Cabinet Office. Maybe that's just relative to recent years. But in terms of the UK-EU relationship and the progress since the May summit, I think we've made good progress. I think that would be exemplified by the announcement that was made. I think, Chair, you were in Parliament for the statement that included both the re-accession to the Erasmus Plus programme in 2027, which I think will give opportunities to many, many young people, but it should be noted the scheme includes adult learners as well. Tens of thousands, we think around 100,000 people will have opportunities from that, so I think that's very, very positive. We also announced in that statement that we would be starting negotiations on participation in the internal electricity market, and we also announced that we would seek to finalise by the time of the next summit, which is obviously this year. There isn't a specific date that's been set for it yet. But we want to, by the time of that summit, have concluded the negotiations on the food and drink agreement, the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, in addition on the emissions trading system linkage and the youth experience schemes. Those are the three objectives. Now, that isn't to say, though, that we do not wish to continue to make progress on those things we would like to have made more progress on at the first summit. And in that regard, I would point to something like the ability of our touring artists to go more easily around the EU and vice versa in respect of those who come from the EU to here, and also things like in services, the mutual recognition of professional qualifications. But as we said just before Christmas, Chair, it's those three big-ticket items, if I can put it that way, that we want to have concluded negotiations on by the time of the next summit.
Thank you. That's helpful. The world is moving in a fast and unsettling pace. We know that the UK's involvement in the SAFE programme, negotiations around that collapsed regrettably last year. The international security landscape has changed very considerably since then, and the reliability of the United States to be a steadfast ally and bedrock of NATO are both in fundamental question. Is there any chance of those conversations about SAFE being resurrected and delivered successfully?
Well, first of all, I would say that, of course, the UK can still participate in SAFE up to 35% of the content, and that remains the case irrespective of the outcome. But let me just go back to that for a moment, Chair, because it is, you highlighted the extraordinarily serious position that there is in international politics at the moment. The Prime Minister has led, maybe it was a leading role in the coalition of the willing, and indeed we signed the Security and Defence Partnership with the European Union on the same day as the May summit last year. NATO is and remains the cornerstone, I should say that, of our defence and security policy. But of course, the Security and Defence Partnership, the coalition of the willing, complements NATO in terms of our approach. But with regard to participation in SAFE and that negotiation in November, I always said throughout this negotiation that I would only sign up to things that involved value for money. I didn't take the view that in this case that it did offer value for money, but that said, I am not at all ruling out participation to 35% in projects. I think it's really important, in fact, that we have that on the table. I would also observe as well the very significant defence contracts that, whether it's with Turkey, whether it's with Norway in terms of the frigate. So we continue to play a leading role, not only in European defence more broadly, but in defence procurement as well. That's hugely important, Chair, not just in terms of hard-edge security, but in terms of jobs up and down the country. But I guess the straight answer to your question is that, yes, we continue to have as our policy that participation up to 35%, where it's in our interest to do so.
So, in sort of summary, in terms of full involvement and maximisation, if the price is right, in principle, yes.
That applies.
Without sounding too much like Bruce
Yes.
Forsyth.
No, absolutely. I'm not ruling it out. If it was on the basis of terms that I felt were in the national interest and value for money, absolutely.
Thank you. Could we turn initially to the SPS agreement? Reports, as we know, about compensation clauses guarding against future governments withdrawing from it for reasons I don't think any logical person could understand why one might wish to, but there we go. Are you able to say whether you think that's a common feature of agreements? Is it something that you welcome? And have any other recent agreements between the EU and a third country had such wording or caveats?
It's a termination clause is just what I would describe as standard in international agreements, and that is quite simply because international agreements are between countries. They are not between the governments that happen to be in power in those countries at the time. So this is just something I would expect as standard in any of these agreements, whether it is SPS or indeed any of the others.
Okay. And are there such requirements in other EU agreements which they've entered into with?
Yes, there are.
So this is this is sort of standard operating procedure. Okay, thank you very much indeed. Now, rather stupidly, I've written down. It's Marcus.
Thank you,
Forgive
Chair.
me. I had a big blank thing next to the line I'd drawn. So forgive me, Mr. Campbell-Savers.
Thank you, Chair. Minister, you've been in post, I believe, for about 18 months now. Given your responsibilities, what do you think the advantages and disadvantages are of you being based within the Cabinet Office?
Very good question, actually, because when I originally took on this role in shadow form in opposition in the summer of, I think it was late summer, September 2023. And of course, there was a debate about where this role should lie, because there is obviously an argument that under other governments you could locate it in the Foreign Office, there may be other government departments you could. But I think the real advantage of it being at the centre has been the direct authority of the Prime Minister. And what that has meant is that I can negotiate with the full authority of the government. It means that decision making, when it needs to be, can be quick, it can be without barriers, and I think that has been a real advantage. I guess, and I'm conscious of the Permanent Secretary sat here to my right, that I guess the disadvantage is I've been adding to the numbers in the Cabinet Office by bringing in the European Union Relations Secretariat. But I have to say that, I've been extremely well served by the Permanent Secretary of that, Michael Ellam, and indeed other excellent officials, including Hermione Gough, who is here to my left. So that setup and that group has worked extremely well.
Does that sense of working with the full authority of the Prime Minister, are there lessons in that for other departments where you feel that might be lacking?
Well, I'm also, if I may say so, at the moment, and I'm sure Chair will come back to this at a future committee, looking at ways in which we might be able to speed up decision making across government. Whether I think, because obviously the role I have is unique in government because I'm the lead negotiator, so I'm not sure you could transfer my model directly to other departments. But the general point I think you're making, Marcus, which is delivering more quickly, absolutely there are lessons on it.
I'd like to return to the issue of the SPS agreement and in particular the role of Parliament. Last year at the committee you told us that on something like the SPS agreement, although DEFRA holds responsibility for the detail in the negotiation, the ultimate trade-off decisions, and I think that's the wording that you used, lied with you. We also understand that in recent months you've declined an invitation to attend the EFRA committee. Do you accept that makes it difficult for Parliament to scrutinise the decision-making?
No, I think this is the 9th appearance before a select committee I've made here in the Lords to discuss the EU-UK relationship. And the issue quite simply on this, I'm not objecting to appearing before select committees, but I do have to make a judgment.
I'm glad to hear that, Minister.
Quite right. The number I appear before. And if you saw the number of invitations I had, I could literally spend most of my time, because the issue of my role is, as even our discussion has set out, it covers so many different government departments. So, there's a very reasonable case for most select committees to invite me along. But if I was to go to every single one of them, then obviously I'm taking down the amount of time I've got to do the core nature of my job. But as regards to the DEFRA Select Committee, I'm sure that there will obviously come a moment when I appear before it. I enjoy Parliament. I enjoy coming to answer questions in Parliament. But there's a limit, I think, the number of Select Committees I appear before.
So if I was to bump into a member of the EFRA Select Committee in the corridor later on and they wanted to know how they could scrutinise the trade-offs that you described, what's the best way for them to do that?
The best way for them to do that is to continue to do what they do, which is turn up at Cabinet Office questions and ask me questions about it, which they regularly do. And secondly, I'm not, Marcus, to be clear, ruling out appearing before it. There may well be, I think I said this in answer to a parliamentary question last week, there may be an appropriate moment that I do appear before it, and I'll be happy to do so.
Thank you. How soon will the scope of the SPS negotiations be known and published?
So, in terms of it, you've already got what was in the Common Understanding of May 2025, which I think was pretty detailed. It isn't a legal text. We will obviously then publish the legal text when it is agreed at the summit, or when we've set the date of the summit. But I think I should just surface the dilemma here, because I am always keen to be as open as I reasonably can about the ongoing negotiations, but it is not either in our national interest for me to either negotiate in public through the press or to try and conduct some sort of public negotiation. That isn't to say that the manifesto that you and I were elected on didn't contain the objectives of this negotiation, because it did, and it set out the framework in which the negotiations take place. And it's well known what our objectives are in terms of the SPS agreement. But I am always making sure that I do strike that balance by being obviously open to answering questions, giving statements in Parliament, but also trying to conduct the negotiations in a negotiating room, not outside.
So expectations management, what should we expect to see published in advance of the negotiations?
Well, the negotiations are taking place. I mean, I think Hermione can, I think we're 10 or 11 rounds in, I think, at the moment. Hermione can talk to that. What I have been delivering is the manifesto, and that is what we've set out. I've also given various speeches in public, setting out what I thought were the objectives of the negotiation. I gave quite a big speech on it last August, in fact, at the end of August. But what you're going to see now is a quite intense period ahead of the summit. Of course, we will publish the full legal text of the summit.
Did Hermione want to come in on that point?
And can I add, as the Minister referred to earlier, we had exploratory talks and published at the summit last year a common understanding which had several paragraphs of sort of the high-level model that we are now doing the detailed negotiations against. We do not anticipate publishing anything further until we have a concluded legal text.
Thank you. Back to the Minister. I mean, will this country be required to comply with EU regulations on plant protection products, pesticides and herbicides, or mycotoxin levels that have been devised without considering UK scientific evidence or the unique climate conditions? Some may have concerns that they're not appropriate for use in this country.
So, first of all, the common understanding envisages that there would be certain carve-outs that we would require and would negotiate, and of course that is the basis upon which we are negotiating. More broadly, though, on the point about rules, subject to that, the government is taking a conscious decision to align with another high standards jurisdiction, and we're doing that pragmatically because it is in our national and economic interest to do so. Just to give some examples on SPS, there are firms at the moment that are, say, paying £61 for an identity check. They're paying, if you get selected for sampling, £1,400. They're paying £200 per consignment for export health certificates. These are all fees that, if we conclude the SPS agreement and implement it, that we can take away from those businesses, which I think is very, very important for us to do.
Are there currently limitations that restrict the UK government's ability to engage proactively with EU legislative developments on new genomic technologies or animal welfare reforms prior to us completing the SPS negotiations?
We're obviously not an EU member state anymore, to state the obvious, so obviously we don't have representation in the European Parliament, we don't have commissioners, etc. anymore. But that isn't to say that my negotiating team is not engaging, and this will be obviously fully scrutinised in Parliament because we will have a piece of primary legislation. I've said I want to get that through Parliament by the end of the year. So the kind of issues, Marcus, you're quite rightly and quite reasonably raising to me, there'll be every opportunity for parliamentarians to raise them in the course of the passage of the bill.
So can you commit to ensuring that there'll be an opportunity for pre-legislative scrutiny of any arrangements for implementing the SPS agreements with the EU or other agreements with the EU ahead of the introduction to Parliament of any bill?
So it's not, in order for me to get it through by the end of the year, we won't go through a pre-legislative scrutiny process, so the bill will be introduced, but the assurance I give you is I am sure that there will be lots of debate on this bill when it appears, and you'll have every opportunity in the passage of the bill, as would ordinarily be the case, obviously for you, Marcus, in the Commons, but for colleagues in the Lords as well, to do that.
And specifically back to the concerns raised by the EFRA committee, can you provide any reassurances, especially with sensitivities around agriculture, which have been enhanced in recent months, you might have noticed, and any additional reassurance we can give that there'll be good scrutiny on those areas relevant to agriculture?
No, absolutely, and they'll also, just to be clear as well, whether that is in respect of DEFRA, the Secretary of State, relevant to myself at the centre, it's hugely important that we're engaging properly with not just the major stakeholders, but stakeholders more generally in this area. There will obviously be thousands of businesses will be affected. There'll obviously be significant benefit, Chair, to businesses who will not have to pay these various fees, etc. anymore. It will make it much simpler for them to export into the European Union. But in terms of stakeholder engagement, hugely important. Totally agree.
Thank you. Peter Lamb. And so just to say, we're expecting a division bell, I think, in about 10 minutes.
Could I ask when the bill is likely to be introduced?
So not set yet. What I have said is that it will be, I want it to be through Parliament by the end of the year. That may require it to be introduced in this session before the King's speech in May. But my objective at the moment is to make sure that we have it in place. I of course, I'm always subject, Chair, to the Upper House and how long they wish to take on these things, but generally I'd like it through by the end of the year, and secondly, to have the SPS agreement implemented by the middle part of next year.
I mean, this would appear to present a question around MPs having access to relevant information. If we're looking to pass the Dynamic Alignment Bill prior to negotiations around SPS and electricity trading taking place, MPs will be voting on legislation without clarity over exactly what it is that they're voting on. Does this present concern?
Well, I'm afraid it is, you come back to the desire to ensure that the cost of living benefits are felt by this as soon as is reasonably possible. In terms of the choreography that you're talking about, I would suggest that the common understanding having already been agreed in May of 2025, we know what the areas are that we are dealing with. So I think that is pretty clear before the bill is introduced. And then just to say on the issue of alignment, the mechanism is already known, if I may say so. Initially, there would be a rule-shaping role for the United Kingdom. There is then, as I say, the pragmatic decision to align, but then it is also the case that where there are disputes, they would go to an independent arbitration panel. And I say, Chair, there's been various debates about the role of the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice has a role in terms of issues of the interpretation of European Union law being referred to it and it being referred back to the panel, but it is not binding on the overall decision of the panel. So that is the structure. And to be fair, I've been clear about that for months.
What mechanisms for parliamentary scrutiny are likely to be within the bill in terms of the provisions that will be brought forward as a result of these increasing relationship with the EU? So
evidently, as you go forward, the way that the alignment mechanism is going to work is obviously around a say for Parliament, laws, secondary legislation going forward. We'll, of course, set that out exactly how that will go into work in terms of the bill. But certainly there is absolutely a role for Parliament. And indeed, when we agreed the common understanding, mutual respect for each other's processes and arrangements was a central part of it. So Parliament is at the heart of it. Peter.
Can we expect the Select Committee to be tasked with reviewing the secondary legislation as it proceeds through Parliament?
Well, obviously the Select Committee arrangements are a matter for Parliament rather than for me, but I've no doubt whatsoever that we will be discussing that and appropriate mechanisms in the passage of the bill.
Yeah, at the start of the parliamentary session, the European Scrutiny Committee was brought to an end with the Leader of the House saying it was no longer required because we're no longer subject to EU documents, despite, of course, the fact that we are in relation to the European Withdrawal Agreement. Could we expect or do you think the government would be in support of the reintroduction of a European Scrutiny Committee to ensure a dedicated body to review these things?
Those of us who lived through it, please say no, Minister.
It's a matter.
To your opinion later, Chair.
It's a matter for Parliament, Peter. I mean, I think that. The question Marcus was asking me actually about the DEFRA Select Committee. I mean, I find myself between lots of different select committees, which is fine, by the way, lots of different select committees being held to account. But I'm sure that whatever we reach on this will be a very important aspect of the debate that we have. It's a matter for Parliament how it wishes to hold, whether it's the point around alignment or indeed me personally, to account.
I mean, clearly the Leader of the House has a significant role to play in that, including that decision, who as a member of the government.
I would certainly have thought that the Leader of the House of Commons would play a facilitating role in it, as he always does.
Okay. So beyond the current agreements, is expected the bill will also reportedly allow for dynamic alignment to extend to other economic sectors in the future. Parliamentary scrutiny for any such decisions, we believe, will be essential. What parliamentary scrutiny mechanisms can we expect the government to build into the bill?
So, first of all, the two aspects that we are looking to conclude by the next summit that involve alignment are firstly the sanitary and phytosanitary agreement, but also the emissions trading systems linkage. As I've also said, the electricity trading negotiation began back in December, but that is not timed to finish by the time of the next summit. Now, with regard to parliamentary scrutiny going forward, clearly, first of all, I should say there's absolutely a role for Parliament. There's absolutely a role for Parliament in terms of the statutory instruments and so on that would be required. And I'm sure there will be, Peter, an open debate as to the best way in which Parliament can scrutinise going forward, and I welcome that debate. But I think first and foremost, it is about this initial bill, and Parliament will have every opportunity to debate it and scrutinise it going forward. But I don't disagree with you at all about the role for Parliament. I think it's hugely important.
Who would be best to speak to about these arrangements as a select committee?
I think that I'm sure you could raise it at business questions would be one way to do it, but I am sure that, if I may say so, Chair, the Select Committee chairs may well have something collectively to say about this.
We may very well indeed.
So Peter, I guess the direct question is also raise it with your chair.
Fair enough, Minister. Will Parliament be given an approval vote on the deal with the EU as a whole, or is it going to be on separate parts the deal emerges to ensure there's democratic legitimacy on the different aspects being reached?
So it'll be on the bill. I mean, Parliament will, as ordinarily be the case, have a vote on the bill and what the bill contains, and hopefully, Peter, you won't have too long to wait for that.
The possibility of the UK having a role in the decision-shaping process has been discussed to ensure some supports, similar to input into the regulations. I think we touched on this earlier, which would be subject to dynamic alignment. Despite not being a member state, can you tell us what decision-shaping will look like exactly, and how can we ensure Parliament's input will be taken into account in that process?
So that's obviously a part of the negotiation going forward as to precisely what it would be, but I would expect it, broadly speaking, to be certainly at official level, certainly looking at what exactly is coming down the track, looking at our particular arrangements. And whilst, Peter, we have been discussing the role for Parliament, we've been discussing the arbitration panel, I should just say as well that the policy intent here is around aligning with another high standards jurisdiction. That is a policy choice the government is making. And that is not to say, of course, we have over £800 billion worth of trade with the EU every year across all sectors. There's obviously a significant amount of trade in terms of agri-foods and agri-food products. I hope we can increase that. I can't, of course, rule out the fact that with that depth and breadth of trade, you're going to end up with disputes in the future. But nonetheless, the objective here is to have that alignment with another high standards jurisdiction because it is good for growth, it is good for the cost of living, it is good for saving costs of businesses, and that's what we're seeking to do.
Yeah, and I wouldn't disagree with any of that. I guess the point is that we need to ensure that there is some mechanism for democratic oversight in the process. And certainly our previous relationship with the European Union suggested that having mechanisms to scrutinise things actually enabled us to better honour the commitments that we had made and ensure they were implemented in a way that did not bring the UK into dispute. Could I ask about devolved administrations in all this? Because if the UK government's playing a role in shaping all of this, and presumably they need to have some mechanism for ensuring the devolved administrations also play a role.
I do want to answer that question. If we could
Well,
vote and then come back. Vote and then come back.
Should we? Well,
Yeah.
why don't you answer that? I think we have got.
So the answer to that, Peter, is absolutely in terms of respect for and working with the devolved administrations. One of the issues we have here is that obviously UK foreign policy is reserved, while some of the implementation, particularly in SPS, is devolved. It's in that area. And I chair an appropriate group, an interministerial group that involves representatives from the devolved administrations. I have been working with them throughout the negotiations. I chaired a meeting, I think it was last week, in which I was talking about precisely this issue as to how we're going to put those arrangements in going forward. So absolutely determined to work closely with them on this matter.
Thank you.
Just before we leave the topic, Mr. Lamb has rightly referenced parliamentary scrutiny. You've highlighted the multiple calls on your time in this important area, different select committees with different interests. Just thinking about the parliamentary handling of the bill, would you see merit in, let's say, 2 days of committee on the floor of the House?
Well, these are
subject to the leader and the Public Bill Office and all the rest of it. But in terms of scrutiny and engagement, would you see, at least theoretically, merit in that approach?
I think the specifics are obviously, Chair, for the usual channels, but frankly, I welcome debate and significant scrutiny of this bill.
Let's just suspend for the moment. Could I encourage colleagues to vote quickly, vote once, and return as quickly as we possibly can? Or, yes, not vote early, vote often. Thank you. And we'll leave Miss Gough and Miss Little to play I Spy. It's very fascinating in this room. Back, John Lamont.
Thank you, Chair. I want to just go a little bit further into the relationship with the devolved administrations. Minister, you said back in June that the government is, and I quote, committed to ensuring that UK departments, the devolved governments, the UK mission to the EU and the Northern Ireland Executive Office continue to work together to determine a shared UK view on EU policy. I just wondered if you could explain a little bit more about how that working together works, given the very clear differences there are in terms of policy outcomes between those different devolved administrations.
I'm not sure how different they are on EU, to be fair, in terms of the work that I'm actually doing. In fact, there's obviously a difference of view, John. I mean, to say the least, the Scottish Government has a very different view of the future of the United Kingdom to mine or yours, let alone the EU. But I think in terms of the work that I've been doing in the recent, there may well be differences of view in terms of where you end up, but I think there has been quite a degree of consensus and support to the actual work the government's been doing, but just put that to one side for a minute. What does that mean in practice? So it means two things. It means official level, me ensuring that I've given the instructions to my officials to be working with the devolved administrations. That is then formalised ahead of, we call them, there's so many acronyms in government, Chair, but IMG, Interministerial Group.
Yes.
And that would essentially involve, John, me chairing meetings. I've actually chaired them around the United Kingdom. Sometimes I just do them for purposes of convenience online, but I do go around the constituent parts of the United Kingdom as well, including I've been to Edinburgh, in fact, to do it. And that's where the devolved administration can then feed into particular priorities that they might have. So it's an ongoing, iterative process, and my intention ministerially is just to continue with that, whether it's in terms of the passage of the bill, whether it's in terms of moving beyond the legal text we hope to get to in May into the implementation phase. I mean, the one caveat I put on that is that there's obviously going to be devolved elections, so there's going to be a bit of a hiatus where there's going to be a purdah period for the devolved administrations where you won't have, as it were, ministers I can directly deal with, and then there's obviously government formation after that. So there is going to be that period, which I'm very conscious of, April, May, but subject to that, my objective is to continue with the approach that I've tried to take throughout.
That's helpful, thank you. I mean, in relation to fishing and the new EU-UK relationship, the Scottish Government described it as great betrayal of our fishing fleet, which was backed up by the Scottish Fishing Federation, the Scottish Whitefish Association and many, many other industry bodies. So it's important to recognise there's not always that uniformity of view which you sort of suggested there might have been.
Well, I was talking more broadly about the work I've been doing, which is very broad across, youth experience, SPS agreement, emissions trading system linkage, Erasmus Plus, for example, which had very wide support. But since you've raised the issue of fishing, Scottish-Salmon obviously took a different view when we had that agreement back in May. What I would say in terms of the different bodies that you've spoken about is, look, my door is always open. They may disagree with me sometimes, they may agree with me sometimes, but I will always engage. And with regard to fish, I don't accept, they know I don't agree with them about that characterisation. What we agreed was a 12-year period from 2026. I believe that gives, first of all, some medium-term stability for investment in coastal communities and our fleet. The Fishing and Coastal Growth Fund of £360 million that we have announced, and obviously that would have Barnett consequentials in terms of Scotland in particular, I think is hugely important. The other point I would say is this: over 2/3 of our catch is exported to the EU. So there is a very clear benefit with the SPS agreement for our fishing communities, amongst other exports. And I am absolutely determined, that's the answer I was giving to Peter in the earlier part of the session, that those benefits are felt as soon as possible, whether it's by our fishing communities or indeed across different business sectors.
As I said earlier, there are industry bodies that take a different view. So I just want to understand, given what the Scottish Government have said, how that fits into how you developed the UK Government's negotiating position? I mean, where did the starting point come from? Did you speak to all the devolved nations? And I'm thinking obviously in relation to fishing here, and the Scottish Government put forward what their outcomes were, and you just decided that was going to be overruled? Or at what point I just want to understand the process. So was the Scottish Government feeding in and it just was overruled, or did that come after you'd already done the deal?
Look, let's just be clear. I, as I said to you in a previous session, I make the decisions that ultimately on the trade-offs, John. Right? That's my role. Some people will criticise, others take perhaps a different view, but that is ultimately my role, my responsibility to do that on behalf of the United Kingdom. Where did I start from in terms of the negotiations? I started from the manifesto. I started from the manifesto we were elected on, which sets out the framework of the negotiations that I am pursuing. With regard to the issue of fishing, we obviously made, not just on fish, by the way, but on a variety of different issues. I remember that weekend before the 19th of May very, very well. I can remember how late that evening was and that weekend was. That's how I would expect the negotiation to be. Of course, I made a decision on the trade-offs that weekend, as you would expect me to, but I would observe that whether it's the Scottish Government, the Welsh Government, or indeed the Northern Ireland Executive, they all had every chance in the, whatever it was, 9-10 months before that to feed in their views as they wished to do so. The Scottish Government expressed its view on the deal we'd reached on fishing. I just happen to disagree.
So I'm slightly confused. On the one hand, you're talking about trade-offs in the context of fishing, but then in the next hand, you're saying...
Overall trade-offs I'm talking about. Overall trade-offs.
So fishing was not part of that trade-off, despite what the industry is saying about it? Where I fundamentally disagree with some of the fishing industry, it's not all of the fishing industry, but if you look at what Thomas-Symonds said, it was a very, very different view that they took. They operate in a different part of the market, as you will understand.
They certainly do. I take the view that the deal we struck is very much in the interests of our fishers, and I think that that is something that we will demonstrate in the years ahead, both by the significant investment we're accompanying this with in our fishing fleet, but secondly, as well as I say, when we reduce the barriers there are to being able to export fish to the EU, I think both those things are of significant advantage to our fishers and coastal communities more broadly.
That's very helpful. Can I move on to a separate point, which hopefully we can find some agreement on? As you will know, the Scottish Government, they have a policy of Scottish independence within the European Union, and during my time as a minister, we spent hours trying to stop the Scottish Government using the UK Government platform to promote that policy. Can you just set out if you're aware of that concern, and are you aware of Scottish Government ministers using the machinery of the British Government to promote a policy which obviously is inconsistent with both your party and my party?
I am not aware of this, but if it was happening, I would want it to be drawn to my attention. And to conclude on a point of agreement, John, we may disagree on many things. We do not agree on the benefit of the United Kingdom.
Thank you very much indeed. Mr. Carling, we turn to you on public inquiries.
Yes, I have a few questions around public inquiries in the landscape in that respect. So just to start off on that front, there have been some changes to the public inquiry system, including the change to the ministerial code requiring Cabinet Office and Prime Minister input before new inquiries are launched. I think you previously said that the government were considering some wider changes to the framework around inquiries. Can you give us an update on that in terms of maybe what those changes are and when we might see them?
Yes, and look, this is a really important issue in my view. And could I just say broadly, first of all, that I do think public inquiries do play an important role for victims in a real moment of public justice. And I don't think we should underestimate that at all. But I would also observe that there are concerns, first of all, around length of time that inquiries take. I think there are concerns that certainly I see it in terms of the work I do in terms of cost. And I think thirdly, there is also a concern around recommendations that, first of all, if governments are accepting recommendations, that they implement them in a timely fashion. But also, I worry as well that if you have an inquiry where many years pass, it may well be that the policy recommendations have then just become, frankly, outdated. Events have overtaken them. So I think there's a variety of ways in which we can look at change. Specifically in terms of where we are so far, You've referenced the change to the ministerial code, and I think that is important. That's to try and get a sense of an overview of the public inquiries that are being ordered at the centre. That's why we're saying now to departments to come to, it's to the centre of the Prime Minister, but in effect to Cabinet Office Minister to look at whether it's appropriate to order a public inquiry. I think that's an important additional lock that now exists. Secondly, I've introduced on gov.uk just a tracking of recommendations for particular inquiries. So I think we're doing that for infected blood and indeed for Grenfell, because I've had a number of examples of this, particularly on infected blood, where I think it's all very well to give a view on a recommendation, but people, I think, very rightly want to see what the government is subsequently doing. The third thing, which I think will make a real difference in this sphere, is the Hillsborough Law, the Public Accountability Bill. When that can be brought onto the statute book and implemented, would introduce, through the duty of candour, a new way of having investigations and inquiries that don't need to be on the same footing as a public inquiry, could be much quicker. I think gives another additional option when various issues need to be looked into. There's also, though, Sam, a broader point, and I'm very interested in the work of this committee on this, because I know this committee is looking at the inquiries landscape, and I will be looking with great interest at the suggestions, because this issue, I suspect, it's not a party political issue, this is a cross-party issue, I think, where there's a great deal of interest across the House as to how we can take, of course, that real public moment of justice, which is important for victims. We certainly don't want to lose that in our public inquiry system. But can it be, frankly, cheaper? Can it be quicker? And can the recommendations be more timely? I think all those things are true.
Yeah, that's really useful, and I think I resonate with some of that point around the timeliness. Particularly, I've done some work with the Independent Inquiry on Child Sexual Abuse, which took 7 years, and then I think the recommendations were released on the day Liz Truss resigned. So that didn't quite go to plan in terms of the news cycle there.
You're all celebrating.
Well, perhaps. I certainly was. But in response to the House of Lords Statutory Inquiries Committee in February last year, the government fully accepted 6 of the 7 recommendations aimed at it, which was great. There was a commitment to publish guidance on inquiries, including advice on engaging victim and survivor groups and on requirements for lesson learned papers. When will those be published?
So I don't have a precise date for you, Chair, but certainly that is something that is in train. We certainly want to be in a position to do that. And I do think that, again, having that guidance available sits as a really important part of this landscape as well. I do go back, though, to the previous question. I think this is an area where we do. I welcome the across the House debate on this, and I don't know, Chair, if there's a time frame yet for your report, but we're certainly looking forward to seeing it.
That's useful. And more widely, you've sort of touched on this, but what role do you see the Cabinet Office fulfilling when it comes to ensuring the government does better with how it implements inquiry recommendations?
So I think 2 things here, because I think, first of all, the role that we play in the original ordering of the public inquiry, and that's why we've introduced that change to the ministerial code, because I think it's to try to get a coordination at the centre, a sense of, when inquiries have been ordered, how many are being ordered. I think there is then, and this is why I've started that piece of work on gov.uk of tracking recommendations. I think that's the other area where I think we do need a cross-governmental look on this, and a single place that it may be victims, it may be stakeholders, policymakers who just happen to have a particular interest in an area. I think that they have a single place to go to is important. And it's important in terms of holding the government of the day, whatever colour it is, to account, but also for them in terms of tracking what the implementation process is.
And on that point specifically, actually, I was having a look at those earlier today, and I think they're a great step in the right direction. They are a little bit hard to access in some circumstances, but I think there's also a limited amount of central information on the overall picture of the public inquiry landscape for people that are interested in that. So with those kind of 4 major inquiries that have dashboards available for them, I just wonder if it's possible to consider overhauling the setup slightly to have perhaps an overall dashboard as well that just shows some more of the different sections of inquiries that we have and how they relate to one another in some ways, and then perhaps have those flow from that. Is something that's been considered?
I confess digital design is not one of my strongest points, but in terms of accessibility across all government communications, of course we keep that under review. And I'm not saying for a moment that the particular design we have at the moment is necessarily the right or correct one, and I think that we are, and I am always open to suggestion, review. If it comes back to us that there are particular aspects of it that might not be as accessible as we want them to be, I'm always more than happy to look at it.
And just kind of following on that transparency theme, I appreciate this is a particular example, and I don't want you to comment on this particular example, but I'm currently working on an issue whereby the Home Office, and indeed the Prime Minister too, have committed repeatedly to implementing a particular recommendation, number 13 it was, from the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse, which is on mandatory reporting of abuse. But it's been quite significantly changed and arguably watered down in the crime and policing bill, and that's flown under the radar in the public setting just because the information the government's put out still says it's implementing it in full. So I wonder if there's a question around where there's perhaps a change of mind or something is more complicated than expected and isn't being implemented as originally designed, whether there's scope for improvements to the transparency of that, and perhaps even for sort of the people who led the inquiries to follow up and comment on government implementation proposals.
So I don't know the specifics of the point you've raised, but I can certainly take that, my officials can take that away in terms of the Home Office writing specifically back to you on that.
I've had dialogue with them, but the broader point of when there's changes,
on
how
the,
we track that.
Let me move just from a specific example, because I think you've raised a couple of really important broader points there. Look, first of all, it may be with some public inquiries that by the time they've reported, the processes of government or the public sector have changed anyway by the time you get to it. So there may either be that it's because, I'm not saying this, I'm not referencing your particular case here, I'm talking more generally. It just may be that it has been overtaken by events, in which case it either might not be implemented or it's already been implemented in a different way, or there's a better way of implementing it, I think is the first point. Second, and here is where I come back to this committee a little bit, because there is a role, I think, for holding government to account on inquiry recommendations. I mean, this is the obvious forum for this, because this is, although there's a distinction between the specific inquiries and the responsibility of individual departments, but the inquiries unit in the Cabinet Office, this would seem to be the obvious forum to hold government to account very specifically on the recommendations. But you're right to say that if a public inquiry is closed, that may well be the inquiry chair obviously moves on, they do something else. But that at that point, it seems to me that it's this committee that then has the role of saying, well, how has government done on this? Where are government in terms of the various recommendations?
That's helpful, because I guess I don't know if there'll be tension between sort of whether a particular department is being scrutinised by this committee versus their usual committee, or how that would work, but I think that's a useful reflection. Just to close from my questions, under Section 14 of the Inquiries Act, ministers have the power to close an inquiry following consultation with the chair. In what circumstances do you think a minister would exercise their power to do that?
I'm not aware it's ever been used, that power. I mean, I stand to be correct, but I don't think it has ever been used. No. I find it difficult to envisage circumstances where that might happen. I mean, if you had, I guess, a chair that behaved in perhaps inappropriate, unreasonable way, I don't know. I can't envisage at the moment the circumstance. We've not, fortunately, to my knowledge, had chairs who behaved in a way that would have been necessary. But yeah, it's never been used, so I'm not. I couldn't give a definitive answer as to when it might be.
But more of a sort of backstop power, just in case something unforeseen happens, I guess, is what we're saying.
Yes, I can see why the power is there, and there is theoretically the possibility that you had a chair that started behaving in an unreasonable or unacceptable manner, but fortunately we've not had that situation as yet.
Thank you.
So if we were to ask you, if you were to ask your officials, taking your perfectly legitimate observations about inquiries and so on and so forth, to where would you look or be directed to say that there's a country that does them really well, gets to the nub of the problem, does it in a timely fashion, makes sure everybody has their say, turns the dial of progress, but does it cost effectively? Is there a jurisdiction that sort of stands out as a example?
I wouldn't pick one and say, look, as of today, that is the one that we're going to choose to emulate. But I think we'll all remember around this table on the COVID inquiry point. I mean, there were some countries that were doing, in Europe in particular, that were doing their inquiries in a very, very quick fashion. What I would undertake to you, though, Chair, is, same with my officials here, is that as we do this piece of work going forward, we will certainly look to the examples of what is happening. I obviously take into account, we are a common law jurisdiction, of course, the different jurisdictions, and I appreciate sometimes that has an impact as to how this landscape is shaped. But that said, I am always willing to learn from best practice. And it seems whenever I have a public discussion about this, most people are agreed on the problems. Most people, we all seem to have an issue, we agree with the problems are, but it's then finding that way forward whilst also making sure victims have that public moment of justice that's essential, I think.
John Bond.
Thanks, Chair. The government, the Home Office, have announced a new inquiry into the grooming gangs scandal. So my understanding from what you've just told us is it's over to each department to run that inquiry. Is there any oversight or any involvement of your team during that process when the inquiry is getting set up or running?
So that is one of the ones that has been under this new process that has been signed off in the Cabinet Office. But from an official level, do we do, I think, have some...
Yes, we do. So I have a unit called the Public Inquiries Response Unit, and they are, in effect, a centre of excellence. So they will reach out to any department setting up a new inquiry to offer assistance in operational setup, best practice, sharing lessons learned, putting them in touch with people who might be able to help them.
That's helpful. As you may know, I take the view that grooming gangs operate across the whole of the UK, sadly, and borders are no obstacle. And I've been calling for the UK government inquiry, to extend across the whole of the United Kingdom because the Scottish Government thus far are refusing to do so. There's no constitutional reason why the UK government couldn't extend the inquiry to the whole of the UK, is there?
I don't think there's a constitutional reason, to my knowledge, but obviously, again, I defer on this point to Home Office colleagues in terms of the scope of the inquiry. But I would undertake, John, because I've not been involved in that, openly I've not been involved in that particular decision, but I'd be quite happy to get them to write to you if that would be helpful.
It would be very helpful. I mean, obviously, bits of it are devolved, a bit like the infected blood inquiry, given the UK-wide ramifications. Yeah,
and of course, without straying into a new topic entirely, but the infected blood issue is it's a pre-devolution age scandal, and some of the issue with infected blood is, of course, it's UK-wide, but some of the Sir Brian Langstaff's recommendations actually require the devolved administrations to...
Because some of the victims of grooming gangs are also
I
pre-devolution as well.
I understand.
Charlotte Kane.
Thank you. I'm turning on to House of Lords.
Right.
You set out last year that the government's first priority in reforming the House of Lords was to remove hereditary peers, which hasn't yet been achieved. Are you disappointed that hasn't yet been agreed between the two houses?
Well, of course, I'd like to see it achieved very soon. I'm not disappointed in the sense that I never had an expectation, given the history of Lords reform, that this would happen quickly. But we are coming to the end of this parliamentary session, so I would sincerely hope that it will be achieved soon.
So there have been some reports that, in response to the bill, some of the Lords have sought to slow down other aspects of the government legislative agenda. Did you share that assessment? And if so, do you think it's problematic?
Well, the lordships themselves will have to answer what their motivation is. But the House, I would just observe that, go back to 1911, the history of reform being delayed is there in our UK political history.
And do you think that anything needs to be done to address that?
Well, the standing orders and procedure of the House of Lords are obviously a matter for them. I think that the work in terms of the abolition of the hereditary principle in our legislature is important. I think it is a first step. We will now have a committee that's been set up by the Leader of the Lords and others that will look at some of the wider issues around retirement age, around participation. I use the word participation because I think that I'm very conscious that although obviously attendance is part of that, you can still have a peer with very, very specialist knowledge that might not want to contribute right across the vista of topics, but can bring something particular. So I think that's why I use the word participation. But that is the next stage we will move to when hopefully the Hereditary Peers Bill finally reaches the statute book.
You mentioned that we're coming up to the end of this session. If it doesn't get through this session, would you use the Parliament Act in the next session?
The Parliament Act has been used very rarely. I sincerely hope we do not get into that territory. That's not what I'm seeking to do. I want it done in this session, and that's exactly what we're seeking to do.
Would a supernumerary list oil the wheels?
Well, the point is this: there is no barrier to hereditary peers being appointed. I mean, it's slightly different for the crossbenchers, I accept that.
Yeah.
But, I mean, for example, I understand 2 Liberal Democrat hereditary peers have just been appointed as life peers. There's nothing stopping the Leader of the Opposition, who will obviously, as she will, in the usual channels, get the opportunity to appoint them if she wishes to. So there's no barrier as to why that might not happen.
Talking about appointing peers, the Prime Minister has appointed them faster, I think, than any other time since 1999. And he's already appointed more life peers than there are currently hereditary peers, so he's increased the numbers. Now, the government identified the size of the House of Lords as an issue. Is the government not keen to address that anymore?
We certainly are keen to look at this in the round, but it is also the case that we have a democratic mandate to deliver our programme. And what is interesting, you said 1999 as the previous example, because obviously what was happening there was you'd have had the 1979 to 1997 18-year period of Conservative government. And what happens is when one of the parties is in government for a long time, there is a bigger division between the number of peers from a party political point of view. So it doesn't surprise me that you use 1999, because obviously what would have been happening there is you'd have had a new Labour government in office that was trying to, as it were, correct the imbalance that would have appeared in the previous 18 years. So similarly, what is happening, we've had 14 years of, firstly it was obviously Conservative Liberal Democrat coalition, but then solely Conservative government for 9 years after. And of course, the division just grew between the number of government peers and opposition peers. So what's obviously happening is trying to correct that imbalance, but frankly to be able to get in a position for the government to get its programme through.
That kind of creates an arms race of size of the House of Lords. You've talked about looking at effectively retirement ages, but what other mechanisms do you have in mind for reducing the size?
The other is about participation. And look, I would simply observe again that there are people who are appointed peers but then do jobs of great public service. I'm not talking about people like that, but that's one of the issues that the committee that is now looking at this second stage of reform is going to consider. I've identified around retirement and participation, but it may well be that the Lords going forward looks at other methods of reducing the size as well. But one of the reasons for having that committee is to try to do this in a consensual way if we possibly can. I very much hope we can.
So let's say you manage to get them down to whatever you consider a reasonable number. Have you got any plans in place for making sure that it doesn't creep up again?
I think these are all matters now for that committee to decide. And look, I am someone who I think the Lords plays a really important part in our role in our constitutional arrangements. I think they bring an expertise, a considered approach to debate that is greatly appreciated. So I certainly don't want to take away what is best about the House of Lords. But that kind of question, your point, which is a perfectly reasonable one about both size and how if we have a trajectory moving in one direction, it doesn't go back in the other, I think it's a perfectly reasonable point. I think how we sought to achieve that is one of the things this committee needs to look at.
So once you've removed the hereditary peers, the bishops will still have their direct route in, but all the other routes will be through prime ministerial patronage. But your manifesto committed to reforming the appointment system. So what are your plans to reform it?
The first thing we've done is that...
Lords.
All right. So the first thing that we've done, and we've already done it, is to introduce citations for when people are appointed to the House of Lords. I always thought it was an anomaly that in our honours system, if you lucky enough to receive, say, an OB, CB, MB, whatever it BM, whatever it might be, there was a reason given, broadly speaking, for why that honour was bestowed upon you. So what we've been doing in terms of this is we've altered that situation now. There are the citations that exist, so it is more open and transparent as to why people are being appointed to the Lords. I think that is very, very important. But more broadly, I think these are all questions, whether it is appointments, whether it is around numbers, whether it is around participation. I have piloted what is I think it's a very important bill on the hereditary principle, but it is narrow in scope through the Commons. But I think this is the moment now to consider in and around these different issues. And I would very much like not to be in the position, when you're asking me quite reasonably questions about the Parliament Act, I'd much rather be in a situation where we are moving forward on a much more consensual basis. Most people, when they see we go to the Lords, broadly agree moving forward on issues like size and others, what needs to happen. But I hope we can find a consensus in that committee.
If I follow up on the citations, they're basically 150 words. Do you think that really provides enough information about why that person has been appointed?
Well, obviously, the broader appointments process is about much more than that, and the assessment. So it's not a comment on the very detailed procedure people have to go through to be appointed to the upper house. But in terms of what is public and what a member of the public just glancing down at it, I don't think that's an unreasonable amount. But it's not a comment on the detailed nature of the process.
So some historic citations have been released. Do you think it would be useful to release all of them so people can get a sense of historically why people were appointed?
Well, I am interested to hear about this. I will quite happily go back and have a look at it now that you've identified it to me. I'm always, as a historian, very interested in these things. So I shall take it away and consider. And
you're now publishing the new appointments, the citations on Gough UK, but sounds like you've found this problem as well. There doesn't seem to be a single location where you can find all the citations. Do you think it would be useful to have a single page so that they could all be seen? Well, listen, I'm all for convenience. And after Sam's question as well, quite rightly holding me to account on the design of the dashboard, I will also take away under review how exactly we are presenting that on gov.uk as well. Yeah. You're a historian, you like to have your documents tidy. Quite right. I'm an archaeologist, I'm used to digging them out, but never mind. So you're part of the reason for these citations is because you think expertise is a strength of the Lords and you want to explain. So normally when you're trying to fill gaps, there's some sort of analysis of what's already there, what the gaps are, what we need. How is that all factored in? Well, the appointment system, there's a variety, there's different aspects going on here. There's obviously the crossbenchers who are in their own category. It's then a matter for party leaders who they seek to nominate through the usual channels in the usual way. I wouldn't for a moment seek to look into the minds of the different party leaders as to the decisions that they make. I do think, though, the broader point you make is a sound one. I think that, broadly speaking, having a variety of life, not just expertise, by the way, but life experience in the Lords is a really, really important thing. And I hope that we can continue to have people from all walks of life and areas of expertise too. So moving on to the thorny issue of disgraced peers, right. And you committed to tackling the issue of how we remove them. What plans have you got to address that?
So on this, the 2014 House of Lords Reform Act, if I recollect correctly, you are disqualified. I think it's if you receive a prison sentence of a year or more, which is the automatic disqualification bit. There's then the House of Lords Conduct Committee, which, again, that is a matter for the Lords in terms of its own regulation. But clearly it's for the Conduct Committee, where there have been particular breaches, then to regulate it outside that automatic disqualification. But look, I emphasise the need here to try to move forward on a consensual basis, particularly when aspects of the Conduct Committee are things that are regulated by the Lords themselves. So again, I'll be obviously following very, very closely the work of the committee and the Lords, and it will obviously be looking at a range, I think, of aspects going forward.
So there's a recent rather prominent case, and you can't remove the peerage other than through an Act of Parliament. So as well as losing their right to sit in the House of Lords, should there be a mechanism to remove the peerage as well?
Well, I tread carefully because obviously there's a very specific process going on with regard, I think, to the case you're referring to, so I tread carefully in that regard for understandable reasons, I'm sure, Chair. We keep all these things under review, but as I say, what I don't intend to do is to start on and embark on another process of reform ahead of the committee. That's very much the second stage. Obviously, I'm very keen to go to where we started the discussion to make sure that we've got the hereditary peers bill onto the statute book. But I think the next step for me is not to get ahead of the committee, and I've just said that I hope it'll come up with something consensual, so me trying to get ahead of it would certainly not facilitate that. So what I'm hoping is that the committee, I'm working closely with it, we can then move on to the next stage.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. Just following on from Charlotte's questions around the Hereditary Peers Bill and the delays to it, I want to ask very briefly about the Terminally Ill Adults Bill, which obviously a private member's bill, currently in the House of Lords, and regardless of people's positions on the particular piece of legislation, I think there are ongoing concerns now that it's not going to reach its conclusion by the end of this session and be sent back to the Commons due to over 1,000 amendments having been put in and no kind of clear end to that in sight. So I just wondered if there's any consideration going on within the government to how it can make sure the will of the House of Commons on that issue is kind of takes precedence and make sure that we're able to have that back either in this session or the next with the use of the Parliament Act.
I don't think that's a question for this Minister.
Is it not?
I think that's a question for probably to be raised in procedure, but this is a private member's bill.
Yeah.
It's not a government bill.
I was taking it more from the kind of procedural aspect of does it create questions for House of Lords powers?
I don't think this Minister is responsible for the procedures of the Lords.
Okay, fair enough.
And just to be absolutely clear, the government's position on this bill is neutral.
I do recognise that.
Yeah.
I just wondered if there was any point.
Could I just ask you, Minister, before we leave the House of Lords and its reform, I think everybody recognises the value that the crossbench peers bring. There's a number of hereditaries who will lose the right to sit in the House, who sit as crossbenchers, and you'll be aware that there is a very constrained nomination process for crossbench peers. There's obviously a concern that it will just make the House of Lords more party political. What, if any, thought has been given to relaxing, if you will, the nomination quota for crossbench peers for 2 or 3 years in order to maintain them at a number such that they can play a proper role in the upper house?
I think, if I'm correct, the leader of the crossbenchers, Lord Kinneal, has recently become a life peer, I believe.
Yes, he has, yes.
More generally on this, obviously that is a matter. It's a matter ultimately, obviously, for the Prime Minister. So I tread carefully. But I do think the broad point, Chair, that you're making is an important one. And indeed, when I was answering questions to Charlotte, I was making clear that I was making some reference to party lists. But of course, I am also very conscious of the fact that I'm not when I'm making that point, including the crossbenchers. And I, by the way, agree with the central thrust of your question, which is I think the crossbenchers play a really important role. I think it's one of the things that gives the House of Lords distinctiveness, actually, from the House of Commons.
Okay, thank you very much. Peter Lane.
Thank you. Our predecessor committee published a very fine report looking at the Lobbying Act. The government has not yet commented on this report, commenting that the area is under review. Would it be possible to tell us what is currently under review? Bit of a jump.
It is. Well, what it means, I mean, first of all, let's just say that before I come to the specific issue of lobbying, can I just refer to some of the more general points here in the ethics and integrity sphere? I'm very proud to have created the Ethics and Integrity Commission, which obviously was a manifesto commitment and was brought into effect, made that decision back in October. I'm also proud that the Prime Minister has given the independent advisor on standards the power to themselves initiate investigations. I think that's another important change that we've made. And you'll also be aware of the introduction of a monthly register of ministers' gifts and hospitality. So I think all these things are very important changes that we are made. I mean, in terms of lobbying specifically, again, I don't see why this has to particularly be a party political issue. I mean, we've always, in the UK, we've taken a different approach to this, to say they take in the United States or other jurisdictions. But I think more generally, we're always looking for high standards across our politics. And I think that if there is work done in this committee, I'm also more than happy to look at that as well. And if there are changes that could be made, I'm looking at them. To your point about the review, I don't think there is a set time frame, but I'm quite open-minded, for example, on things that might be thought to improve the system coming before me.
So what work is currently taking place on that review?
Well, I understand there's a review that is taking place. I think we have a group in the Cabinet Office to look at this amongst many other things. But again, as I say, it's something that I'm very open to ideas on. The focus, though, to be absolutely frank with you, Peter, in terms of the first part of the government's life has been those changes to the Minister's Gifts and Hospitality Register. It's been around creating the Ethics and Integrity Commission, which is the manifesto commitment, and the changes we've made to the independent advisor.
I appreciate this might not be an area that's been your total focus in terms of this particular thing, but it would be useful for this committee to have some idea when we could get a response to the report that was published by its predecessor. Okay. If that could be addressed.
We can write back to the chair on that.
And if it is not currently happening, more detail as to what exactly it is that is holding that up and when that might be concluded. Moving on, in your letter to us December last year, you noted the improvements to departmental transparency data under this government. Certainly there's been a lot of improvements. We've been through a lot of them in detail with various regulating bodies. But details of ministers' meetings are still only being produced quarterly in arrears, and SPADs are not fully covered. Could we ask why that is the case?
I think there's a wider debate, I guess, about what should be included. Again, I'm more than happy to look at this as part of the review. In terms of ministerial meetings, I think quarterly is as appropriate as anything else. I think it's a period that is not unduly onerous in terms of work that officials have to do, but I think it is still transparent in terms of the meetings that ministers are having in their official capacity. But to your wider point, again, I'm more than happy to look. I'm open-minded, Peter, as you probably gathered about these things. I'm being absolutely frank with you. My delivery priorities have been the manifesto things that I have been delivering, but I'm more than happy to take that away and look at it.
Thank you. The plans, there have previously been plans to have a transparency portal created. We understand that those were dropped due to a lack of funding. Could we get any idea as to how much that was estimated to cost?
I don't have a specific figure, and sadly it was before my time, but I'm very happy to go away and find out.
That would be great. I mean, one thing which is interesting around this is small organisations have taken this task on themselves, such as Transparency International, UK, and they're managing to build that kind of accessible source of information for the general public in a way that the government has not managed to be able to. Is there a reason why we think those organisations are better placed to deliver that than the civil service?
Well, I mean, as the Minister said, we are looking at all of the policy and reform options here, and I think it's important that we come back not only to set out what's happening, but also to set out the cost of us doing more transparency and more reporting in this place, and then ultimately that will be a matter for ministers to decide whether we're able to prioritise that within our funding allocations. There's no specific reason other than funding and resources.
I appreciate these things happen for a range of different reasons, but clearly it's an area where the government has already had some criticism early on around some of these issues, and where action appears to not necessarily be happening promptly. It's always going to raise questions as to what the reasons behind that are, which may not always be a charitable interpretation that the public gives.
Well, just to be clear, though, I mean, it's not anything inappropriate. We're obviously moving forward on a variety of policy streams here in different ways, and I think the changes, I mean, just to take the ethics and integrity point at top, the change to allow the independent advisor, Sir Laurie Magnus, to initiate his own investigations is a step that this Prime Minister has taken that was not previously taken, and that is openly allowing an independent person does really excellent job, Laurie Magnus, and has done this on a variety.
Did hear from him yesterday morning.
Yeah.
This committee, we heard from him yesterday.
Yeah. Oh, there we are. So that I think has been. So I think whilst you're quite right, Peter, to push us on whether it's in regard to lobbying and some of the other issues about responding to you, which we're more than happy to do. I don't think that should either move away the focus from the changes that we have made. I think just to pick up just for a minute the Ethics and Integrity Commission. I mean, once we get the Public Accountability Bill, the Hillsborough Law, onto the statute book, that committee will be tasked with producing, if you like, the model, the core of the codes of ethics that are then going to be rolled right across the public sector. I mean, that is a really significant change that we are introducing with regard to trying to prevent state cover-ups in the future. I mean, it's a really significant change. And that work, that culture change, I mean, Sir Brian Langstaff, in his report on infected blood, said that the issue was not that, when you look at these various scandals and state cover-ups that have happened, he said the issue is not so much that you have individual people deliberately hiding things. Indeed, if you did, it might be easier to deal with because you could identify that person. What Sir Brian Langstaff said is that we've got to get to a stage where we change what is a pervasive, in some areas, but not all, culture of people, when they're under pressure and terrible things have happened, putting personal and institutional reputations above the public good. So that, I think, and leading that cultural change will be, really transformational. So whilst, you're perfectly reasonable to push us, you're right to push us on some of these issues, I think it's also right to acknowledge that if we're talking about transparency and accountability, I'd argue that getting the Hillsborough Law onto the statute book and that driving that implementation of duty of candour is one of the most radical changes we've seen, in this transparency and accountability area.
Fair point.
Can I just, Minister, could I just ask you in response to something that Ms Little said, because I think it probably requires a ministerial answer than an official's. All of us as practitioners will be aware of the low and lowering confidence that many of our fellow citizens have in the process of politics and the practice of politics. On the transparency issue, what price can you put on it? Ms Little said it would depend upon the costs with regards to maximising transparency, given the urgency of it and the importance of the issue. Is it something that one can really put we'll only progress on this dependent upon how much it costs, i.e. it needs to be done as a matter of priority and principle? Well,
the issue there, though, is that you're absolutely right to identify the issue of trust in politics. I don't think we disagree about that. I don't think we disagree either on the importance, generally speaking, of transparency. I'd still argue, though, by the way, that I think this came out in one of the answers I gave to Marcus earlier, that there are still some areas, and I'm talking about in totally different context, negotiating with the EU, where clearly I think there are things that for the national interest, there's lots of examples in security sphere as well, that for the national interest have to remain not immediately in the public domain. But the question is not so much what price transparency, the question is what, with the resources we have, we can do in that area. Now, if you think about the answer I just gave to Peter, if we are able to get the Hillsborough Law onto the statute book, I will then look to lead a ministerial implementation board to try and drive that cultural change, both in terms of what I would describe as the government civil service loosely, but also then the wider public sector. Now, none of these things come without cost, that's official time and et cetera, et cetera. So it isn't so much transparency, cost transparency, it's more, we all agree that's essential, but it's prioritising within it, what are the things that are going to be most important in terms of driving this, I think.
And finally, you referenced the changes with regards to initiation that Solari now has, and some other welcome evolutions in that arena. We've been taking evidence from across the piece on the importance of propriety and ethics and how it can be strengthened and improved, etc., as I know you know. I think there's a growing concern on this side of the table of the, and I don't use this in necessarily a pejorative sense, in the sort of slight complacency that all of these things will still always be run on the sort of good chaps principle, with good chaps and chapesses being practitioners, and not enough future proofing to provide more robust, statutorily underpinned guardrails to how these things operate. I don't need a detailed answer now, but could we leave with you that might be an area of policy evolution that does require a bit of elbow grease?
It's not, and I think I would just I understand precisely the point, Chair. I'd just make this observation. It's always going to be the case, obviously, that one Parliament can't bind a future Parliament. But that said, I always think that the test, certainly the historic test of policies as to whether they stick and make a difference, is whether a government of a different colour subsequently doesn't undo it. And I think that is certainly something I think we need to have in mind in change in this area.
Would you accept that there's a more rigorous process, again, transparency and advocacy, that needs to be undergone in the public domain if one is seeking to repeal something which is in statute, rather than something which can just be done with the flick of the executive pen, because it's all informal and advisory and not binding?
I think it is certainly the case that something that is embedded is more difficult to subsequently change. Yeah.
Colleagues, any further questions for the Minister and his team? I don't see any.
We had a quite thorough run around the various issues.
We had a good canter over the course, and nobody fell, which is good news. Ms. Little, we look forward to seeing you on the 10th, where again we will pick up the pensions issue, and I was able to have, when we were voting, a very brief conversation with Geoffrey Clifton-Brown as the chairman of PAC to make sure that there isn't duplication but proper parliamentary focus on that issue. So watch this space, as they say. But can I thank, on behalf of the committee, the three of you for your time this afternoon, for taking our questions and for answering them as well. Order.